Take all the running backs who have retired, who started their careers 2000 or later. That includes first through seventh round draft picks. That includes undrafted free agents. Everyone who started their career beginning in 2000, 2001, 2002, and so on up the line. There's about 850 or so running backs in that pool of active and retired. Of the retired, there's, I don't forget what it is, maybe 700 or something like that. Of that group, 148 have had less than 350 college touches. So 148. And of that 148 that have had less than 350 college touches, only 9 have had at least 400 career fantasy points, which is what I want to talk about for a few minutes as it relates to Trey Benson. The ones who have had more than 400, who had less than 350 touches in college, but had more than 400 fantasy points in their career include Peyton Barber, Kenny Watson, Willie Parker, Mike Tolbert, Chris Ivory. Those were all undrafted free agents. Peyton Hillis, who was a sixth rounder. I talked about him one of the first podcasts about the supposed Madden curse and why it's not a curse, but it is real. If that doesn't make sense to you, listen to the podcast and it will. Chris Thompson, the fifth rounder, and then 2 third rounders. Stephen Ridley, who finished with about 400 something fantasy points, and Kenyon Drake, who's the best of the group. Just over 1,000 fantasy points. I've mentioned it before in the podcast. He is a unicorn. It is just not customary. None of the other running backs had more than, I think maybe 700 fantasy points. I forgot if Willie Parker cracked that, but the point is, it's very unusual for anyone with this little volume to get that kind of, career fantasy production. It's basically Kenyon Drake, and you could say Willie Parker are kind of the ones that have stood out. The rest, you might have 1 or 2 good seasons or decent seasons. In Ridley's case, for example, I think it was his first 2 or 3 seasons, he was fine, and then he fell off a cliff. Like that was it for his fantasy value. Trey Benson was drafted in the 3rd round. He looked good last year. I was very high on him this summer, mostly because I didn't bother to look at the spreadsheet and really study it. I really need to start doing that. Because I've talked about the spreadsheet a number of times, and I think I've reached a point now with the spreadsheet, with the amount of data that's in here, that to an extent it is actionable. I'm not saying that Trey Benson is sell now, before it's too late. He doesn't have a lot of fantasy points for his career. Surely he can get there, but the averages don't bode well. For all the running backs, whatever I said, the 158 running backs that have had less than 350, or 148 running backs that have had less than 350 touches throughout their college career, the average career fantasy points for first round picks is non-existent because there's never been a first rounder in the last 25 years that has had that few touches in college. For round 2 running backs, 114 fantasy points is the average. For round 3, it's 362, and that's the high. Because round 4 through round 7, in order, career fantasy points for underutilized college running backs, less than 350 touches, is 109 fantasy points for 4th rounders, 142 for 5th, 73 for 6th, 42 for 7th, and 126 for undrafted free agents. That bump for undrafted free agents is for guys like Barber, Watson, Parker, Tolbert, Ivory, who essentially helped push that up. These were guys who were, and I find this with the spreadsheet, that undrafted free agents, on average, generally do better than 7th rounders across a whole bunch of metrics, and sometimes do better than 6th rounders. So it's not surprising to see that data. It is pretty cool to see it laid out so clearly, even with underutilized college running backs. The fact is, undrafted free agents have been, on average, the 3rd most reliable career fantasy point producers among the under 350 college touch crowd. It's all relative. It's only 126 fantasy points for their career, Not a lot, but it's worth noting. Um, the third rounders, I think, basically steering that in that direction of 362 or whatever is the fact that Kenyon Drake and Stephen Ridley are on that list. They're pushing that average up as it deserves to be. I mean, Kenyon Drake, again, a unicorn. You got to give respect to the fact that he broke the mold. It's just that no one else has broken it after him. For, a third rounder, a fourth rounder, a second rounder, a fifth rounder, they don't do this stuff. Chris Thompson, as I said, is the exception among fifth rounders. And you don't think of Chris Thompson as fantasy relevant because he only had about 450 career fantasy points. But that's kind of the idea, is that you don't get the kind of longevity with little used college running backs with very, very few exceptions. So that brings us back to Trey Benson, who had just under 350 college touches. He is obviously someone who is from in terms of passing the eye test, talented. And yet he disappointed yesterday. And you could argue Seattle's defense coming in had given up only 3.2 yards per carry. It was not an easy matchup. Benson did fine. He only had 8 carries because it was a negative game script for a good chunk of the game. He did have 5 catches for 19 yards. He got to double digits in fantasy points. Hooray. And his backup, Emari Demercado, stole the show because he got a touchdown. And so the assumption there is, well, he poached a touchdown. It could have gone to Benson, all things being equal. It didn't. And maybe going forward, Benson is going to be capped a little bit by Demercado. That may be the case. I'm more interested in the fact that Benson, as a little used college running back, the odds are very high if you just go based on probabilities, and the 90-something% chance or more that, based on historical data of the last 25 years, that Benson's career is going to be disappointing. Despite the fact that he started out so strong and coming into this season looked like he could potentially go toe-to-toe with James Conner. Now that Conner's out, it's Benson's backfield, and these next few games are going to be really important in terms of our understanding of whether Benson can be someone we can really trust on a week-to-week basis for the rest of the season. Dynasty managers should be extra cautious. And if I'm a dynasty manager with Benson, having looked at these numbers last night, I can say I would sell Benson immediately. I don't want to wait till 2026 to see if he can run it back and be the guy that, that I would imagine he could be based on a strong rookie campaign on only 69 touches. I'm not going to look at him and say, oh, he'd give me 250 touches and, maybe like 200 fantasy points. Yeah, because that generally doesn't happen. I know that he's good. We all know that he's a good running back. Many of us pushed him as someone who, like I said, was undervalued based on ADP. But the bigger concern is just the historical data. I can't run away from that. I can't pretend I didn't see it. I need to look at this data more before next season, because clearly I keep coming back to it in these podcasts, and it's alarming how consistently accurate it is in terms of determining the fantasy fates, dynasty-wise, of these running backs. So to summarize, I don't know what Benson's going to do this year. Last night was disappointing. There are reasons for it. We should feel relatively confident that Benson will have some good weeks this year. Demercado is not a real threat to overtake him on the depth chart. And that being said, Benson's overall value heading into 2026 to 2027 should be viewed as minimal. And that is based on historical evidence. And I'm sticking with the evidence, not just what I see on the game tape. I'm BJ Riddell, Fantasy Football for Winners. Follow me on the blog. Email me anytime. Talk tomorrow.